Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about why our ideas for fixing politics aren't as easy and obvious as we think. And this topic was prompted by a Substack post written by a podcast guest of mine from a few weeks ago, Stephanie Houghton. Basically, the idea was how people often think they have the answers to fixing democracy in America, but we often think they are far easier and more obvious solutions than they really are. And we can all fall into this trap of thinking our policy or reform solution is more obvious, sound, and foolproof than it actually is. Though for some people, that's a chronic attitude. And to be honest, I find it kind of obnoxious when people regularly think they have an easy solution to politics and political problems, such as, oh, we need to get money out of politics, or we need to get rid of the Electoral College. Not saying that those things are wrong or anything like that, but I'm saying that those are just, they're not really in depth. It's as if other people haven't been able to come up with obvious solutions before. When it's something wide-ranging and broad, it's never going to be an easy fix. And that's not to dunk on people's thoughts and opinions about reforming politics. We should encourage people to suggest ideas, but we also need to get people to think more critically about their own ideas for reform and how to make these reforms potentially happen. So what are the most critical things to think about when you are designing your own ideas or thinking about other people's ideas for making American politics function better or for improving policy? Well, that's what we're talking about today. So here we go. First of all, we need to talk about a prevalent problem in politics, this level of political overconfidence that we see. We often think our ideas for fixing politics are more sound or obvious because we all think we know more about politics than we actually do. It's what many researchers and commentators call political overconfidence. And all of us can exhibit this to some extent, but for some people, it's a very common thing to do. Academic research has shown a propensity for political overconfidence in the public. It's similar to that Dunning-Kruger effect, where people are often poor at self-assessing their knowledge and skills, oftentimes overestimating them. But how does this political overconfidence manifest? Well, one, it makes us more defensive of factually wrong beliefs about politics. We think we've already got them figured out. So somebody coming in to try to tell us, well, actually, no, that's not what it is. We think, oh, this person is an idiot. They don't know what they're talking about. I've got this figured out. Number two, we underestimate the political skill of our peers being sometimes people who think similarly than us, but we still think we know more than them, or people, especially on the other side of an argument, we tend to think, well, they don't know what I think, so they don't know what I know, they don't think what I think, so they obviously don't know what they're talking about. That's another example of political overconfidence. Number three, those who believe themselves to be political experts often dismiss the guidance of real experts. There's a lot of self-professed experts in politics, as what a former professor of mine called a local political genius. You see them talk all the time on social media. And that's not to say that real experts can't also be susceptible to overconfidence, but there are some people who have not really worked in or studied a field of in politics and think they know all about it. Another way political overconfidence manifests is that it interacts with political partisanship in making partisans less willing to listen to peers across the aisle. So, if I'm a Republican, all those Democrats are stupid. If I'm a Democrat, all those Republicans are stupid. If I'm an independent, all the Republicans and Democrats are stupid. And then Republicans and Democrats might think independents are stupid. It's not really born out of, oh, we're critiquing really what these people are thinking. We think we're critiquing what they're thinking, but really we're just looking at their labels and assuming their intelligence at that point and overestimating our intelligence. Another way that political overconfidence manifests is that it increases our affective polarization. That is to say, our negative feelings toward opposition. We get angrier at them. We are more disgusted by them. We think even more that they're dumb or that we should be fearful of them. They don't know what they're talking about, and they're going to destroy everything. And then lastly, Political overconfidence manifests itself as a more staunch ideological and partisan unity. Now, that's not to say that people who aren't hardcore partisans or ideologues can't also be politically overconfident. Again, it can happen to anybody, but you do see it a lot in people who are very far to either the right or the left because they're very set in those ways and thinking that their ideology explains everything in the world. And look, I've been guilty of some of these things too. I'm not going to pretend that I am an exception to the rule because every one of us has been guilty of it. But some people are regularly guilty of it, and we need to be a lot more self-introspective and self-reflecting. And there's also the problem that some people have a psychological intolerance of uncertainty. They have to have a stable view of the world. It almost makes them sick to think that there's more nuance and uncertainty in the world, especially with stronger partisans. But you don't have to be one of those to have an aversion to uncertainty. Politics is, with very few exceptions, as black and white as it's often made out to be. There are just all these nooks and crannies that you have to account for. And when human beings are involved, there's going to be some sort of flaws in their reasoning, no matter how logical we think we are. So one of the fronts, if you will, to talk about when it comes to thinking we know more about, or that our political ideas are more sound than they actually are, is we don't really do a good job of distinguishing between vague and specific ideas. You really should know the difference between whether your solution is vague or specific, because a vague idea, a general, broad, this is what we need to do, that is not a solution. It is merely the semblance or beginning of a solution. But how do you know it's a vague idea? Well, for one, it sounds more like an ideal than an actual policy. So if you hear somebody say, we need to get money out of politics, okay, maybe we need to do that, but that's not an actual solution. That's not an actual reform. How are you going to get that money out of politics? How are you going to limit money's impact on politics? You have to get more specific on that. That's how you actually come up with a solution. Another way that you know it's a vague idea is that it's more of the end goal of an idea, not the idea itself. So maybe you're thinking, we need to increase voter turnout. That's not an actual solution. That is a very vague idea that could become a solution. How are you exactly going to achieve that increased voter turnout? And that could be a whole bunch of different things, both indirectly and directly impacting voter turnout. And then another way you know that an idea is vague and therefore not really an actual solution is it doesn't really include any specific provisions on what to do. So it might sound a little bit more specific, like we need an age limit on government officials. Okay, well, what is that age limit? Are there any exceptions to that rule? That's when you start to get to an actual solution. Now, this does not mean, I want to make this clear, it does not mean that vague ideas are bad or unwarranted or that they shouldn't be put out there, because they can start necessary conversations. If we were to really agree, and I'm not saying that this is or isn't what we should be going for, but if we talk about, let's all agree that age limits on government officials are necessary for more government officials, because some states do have that already for their state level officials and even some local officials. Okay, well, we can start from this whole, okay, we need age limits, a maximum age limit on government officials because of X, Y, and Z. Now you're getting the ball rolling. But the age limit itself, or just saying that we need an age limit, is not a solution. Just when you're proposing a vague idea as a way to get to a solution, just don't think that it is a viable solution itself. It could start to lead to a solution, but it's not the actual solution. But even if you get a more specific on your provision, so you say the maximum age that an elected official or a government official should be in office for is 80 years old, or we need to increase voter turnout by making election day a holiday, or we need to get money out of politics by putting a cap on spending on these kinds of elections. Even if it is specific, it's not necessarily a complete idea that is actually feasible. your idea might be just getting rid of a current policy, but have you thought about what you are replacing it with? A lot of times we don't think about that other side of the equation, even if it seems obvious what we do to replace something. It's similar to those of us who are sports fans and we root for a team that's had a bad record and we want the coach fired. It's like, get this bum out of here. He's so bad. Just fire him now. Okay, well, we don't always think about the replacement and if there is a potential better replacement. We just know we're angry at a current policy and we want it gone as soon as possible. But the replacement could potentially be worse than the current policy that we have. Just because you have something new doesn't mean it's good. So then having nothing to replace it can also be particularly bad too. Some people think that nothing would be better than the thing that we have now. And you might think that, but you might also be speaking out of bias against the current policy. And it turns out, oh, wait, it's actually not good to have nothing in place. So let's talk about, like, if you were to get rid of the Electoral College, what do you replace it with? Some people might think it's obvious. Oh, just simple direct election, one person, one vote. Okay, but you need to, how are you exactly going to codify that? Because everything needs to be codified. It needs to have specific legal language that makes that happen. You need to actually implement it in the U.S. Constitution. But is there potentially a different way to go about it? Is there some sort of hybrid between Electoral College and a direct election? A lot of times people think it's just one or the other in that regard, but there might be other ideas, because back when the founding fathers were debating the framers of the Constitution, were talking about the U.S. Constitution and how to write it, there was a lot of different discussions about how to elect the president. Or what if you talk about something a little more specific policy like Obamacare? So again, this is not to say that I think that the Electoral College or that Obamacare is good or bad. These are just examples I'm using to illustrate my point. If you say we need to get rid of Obamacare, okay, well, what are you replacing it with? Just getting rid of Obamacare is not really a solution in itself. You have to have at least something in mind to replace it with. But whatever your idea is, it still has to go through some sort of political process, which we'll get to in a moment. But specific ideas have their own issue to contend with compared to more vague ideas, and that's opening themselves up to more concrete criticisms. When you start detailing your specific idea, there are inherently more avenues for opposition. And you see it a lot of times in the legislative process when bills are being debated in committees in the legislative chamber or between chambers, because if it's a bicameral legislature, which almost all of the legislatures in the U.S. are, both chambers have to agree on the exact same wording. So there might be, the general idea might be something that everybody agrees on, but the exact specifics need to be talked about. And then, of course, if there is large disagreement, then you have to work even harder to get agreement on something. Now, some opposition is good for refining your idea, because pretty much no idea is perfect. Definitely no idea is perfect, but no policy idea comes completely done when it's proposed. It needs to be hammered out. It needs to be refined. Now, of course, with this opposition can come some political games being played, and that's what happens all the time in the legislative process. But some pushback is good. You should not have everything just being run roughshod. We have a more deliberate political process for a reason. Now, it does not mean that it couldn't be more efficient, but things are not supposed to happen like that. They're supposed to take at least some time. Speaking of these rules to follow, what are the relevant political and legal rules to follow when you're implementing your policy? Because ideas are not debated and implemented in a vacuum. How it becomes reality can differ a lot depending on what the policy is and where it is being implemented. Because it's all well and good to have an idea, and it may be a great one, it might be the best one anybody could come up with, but you still have a process to go through to make it happen. You don't just get to say, okay, this is something we need to do, and people say, yeah, I like that, and then boom, it's done. No, it does not work like that. And there might be a whole bunch of avenues for implementation that may or may not be applicable to what you are trying to do. So, for example, whatever this reform is, would it be a federal, state, or local political change? Because some ideas are in the purview of one level of government, but not another. For example, we talk a lot about federalism. What is in the scope of federal government versus what's in the scope of state government? So is it something that federal government legally does not have a hand in? Or is it something that is ambiguous, whether it's federal or state, but you think it should be implemented at the state level instead? Or is it something that actually should be a local level thing that's implemented? Some ideas also might need time to build at a lower level of government before it can be implemented at a wider level. So you might need a proof of concept at the city or county level before you can expand it even further. Now, whether it's federal, state, or local, does it have to be done through legislation? Are there legislative restraints on what the bill can do? For example, most states have what are called single subject rules for legislation. So legislators can only put forth bills. And usually there's an exception, a few exceptions, like particularly budgets, because budgets are inherently all encompassing. But beyond that, most legislation in a lot of these states have to focus on one specific policy area. So it can't say XYZ about medical marijuana and then A, B, and C about guns, unless somehow that thing about guns ties back to medical marijuana. You have to space those out into different bills for the most part. There are a few states that don't have those single subject restrictions, but the general idea between states is that for their state legislatures, they have to be single subject rules. Now, Congress notably does not have that restriction. And that's partly why you see some really huge bills in Congress, because they can cover a whole lot of different things. Also, are you allowed to propose this legislation as a citizen? Because in some states, there are avenues through which you can do that. Or as an interest group, you can propose legislation and a legislator can take it up and say, okay, you know what? I'm going to put forth what this says, or maybe make minor tweaks. What is the partisan and ideological makeup of that legislature? Because obviously, whether it's Republican or Democrat, or whether it's conservative or liberal, and depending on what your policy idea is, it may or may not be amenable to what you are trying to do. Or is there a different relevant demographic to account for? So if we talk about age limits again, if we want to implement age limits, a legislature that skews older probably won't be amenable to it, depending on certain exceptions that you might make, like, oh, people who are in office right now are not subject to age limits, for example. But if it's not, making it legislation is not as viable an option, would it be best as a ballot measure instead? A ballot measure is basically legislation that citizens can vote on. And a lot of states, most states allow that. And a lot of local areas have their own version of ballot measures. We do not have that at the federal level, at least not yet. Probably won't ever have that at the federal level, but you never know. Most states and lots of local areas have ballot measures that you can vote on, but they have a process that they go through. And a lot of these, or each of these states and local areas, has different processes for which a measure can get on the ballot. They have to have a certain number of signatures on their petitions that are required so that it can qualify for the ballot. You don't just say, hey, I want this ballot measure on the ballot, and then poof, it goes there. No, you need lots and lots of signatures, especially in bigger states. Where do those signatures come from? So does it have to come from multiple areas of the state, or is there no stipulation in that regard? Who can gather those signatures? Because in some states, they might have certain restraints on who can gather those petition signatures. All sorts of other nooks and crannies to account for. Might also depend on what that ballot measure is. It might have to get more than 50% of the votes in a couple of states, or in some states, if it's a specific policy area like taxes, it might need a higher threshold of the vote in order to pass. So all sorts of different things to account for in that regard. But whatever the case is, whatever your reform idea is or your policy idea, you have to look at what the legal and political and legislative rules are for making that policy happen. Doesn't matter how great that policy is, whether objectively or subjectively, there are certain checkpoints you need to hit in order to make it a reality. But even if you have a super great idea, every single idea has flaws, trade-offs, or blind spots. Just about every policy or reform idea can be argued against in some way. Sometimes those arguments are disingenuous, but you're never going to have a perfect policy. It's just not going to happen. I hate to break it to you. We don't want to admit it, but every idea for reform has a weak spot and it will be exploited by somebody. Now, whether they succeed in exploiting that and trying to kill whatever idea you have, that's a whole other can of worms. But there's always going to be a weak spot. There might be one of those weak spots. It might be that there's an aspect of the policy that can't be, or an aspect of policy in general that can't be accounted for because you can't address every single problem. Most policies have to be narrow in their focus in order to actually get passed. Because if they're trying to cover too many things at once, you're going to get way too many different viewpoints on, hey, no, we can't do, I don't like this particular part of the policy, so this policy is not going to happen. You need to be a lot more narrow and focused on what that policy is trying to do. Also, if we accept the mindset that government and policy can always be made better, then that inherently means there is something that a policy was not able to fix before. That inherently means there was some sort of weak spot. And if you do legitimate policy analysis, actual policy analysis, not some super biased interest group did a study and said, oh, see, everything about this thing is great because, we came up with it. No. Legitimate policy analysis will show you that there's always a trade-off between ideas. If you do X, you won't be able to do Y, or you won't be able to do Z. You only have so much time and effort to expend trying to make a reform happen. Or multiple ideas you have for a problem, but you might only find supporters for one of those ideas, so you focus on that one idea instead. You can't fix everything. There's just too many things going against you. It would be nice if we could fix everything, but we can't. In campaigning, there's this concept, and I've brought it up on several episodes of the podcast before, what we call a SWOT analysis, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And you could do something similar with your reform ideas. You could take one of your reform ideas and say, this is one of the strengths, or these are a bunch of the strengths. These are potential weaknesses. This is opportunities to get people to support it. And these are threats that can kill support for that idea. Every single idea for a policy or a reform is going to have a strength, a weakness, an opportunity, a threat. It's always going to be the case. No matter how tied we are to our idea, no matter how great we think it is, it's always going to have something that can be attacked. And also, there are almost always unintended consequences with your policy idea. You can deeply and genuinely analyze policies to try to root out these unintentional issues, but some of them are only going to crop up after you implement a policy change or reform. Hence the fact that they're unintended consequences. So one of the ideas I want to give, or an example I want to give to demonstrate this whole idea about trade-offs and flaws, is I'm going to go back to a class I did in grad school, public policy analysis. And one of the projects, I think it was the end of year project we had to do, is we had to do a policy analysis proposal, and we had to go through different ideas based on a certain policy problem. And my policy analysis project was on obesity in kids in Florida, something that I have personal involvement in because as a kid, I struggled with weight as well. And so basically we had to come up with the background of the problem and then make several proposals for how to address it, and then talk about all the strengths and weaknesses that they had and the trade-offs there. So I can't remember the exact policy proposals I came up with, but it was something along the lines of these 4 ideas to fix or at least address the problem of obesity of kids in Florida. It was subsidizing participation on school sports teams, expansion of recess for elementary and middle schoolers, some way of subsidizing or expanding access to healthy food in low-income communities because of the prevalence of what are called food deserts in Florida, which basically means low-income, low-access areas that have little access to affordable, healthy food. And then the fourth idea was a public-private partnership with the YMCA and other relevant nonprofits and private organizations. And so each of these proposals has some good things about it and some drawbacks. I picked one in the end. I'm not going to say which one I picked, but each one of these policies had drawbacks and good things. So if we subsidize sports participation for school teams, it's on the positive side, will give kids an opportunity to build camaraderie and give them direct access to training regimens because they're practicing all the time. They're working out in the off season, but it could be costly because you're trying to pay for all of these sports teams. So even ones you might not necessarily think of. So you got football, basketball, soccer, baseball, track, hockey, if you probably more so in the north, although in the south there is a little bit of that. Lacrosse, swimming, track and field. It's softball, baseball, or I think I said baseball already, but softball. All of these sports then you would have to subsidize. So it could get very costly. And also kids don't necessarily want that kind of environment. That might be too high stakes for them. They might want to do sports, but they don't want to do it for a school sports team. If we talk about the expansion of recess idea, you're getting more kids out of the classroom for a time to recharge their brains because don't want to just sit in the classroom all day and, make their eyes glaze over with all the stuff that they're doing in class. So you're getting them to run around a little bit. And it's more direct impact on their exercise. So you give them more time to exercise, but that could also cut into time for other classes. And it doesn't address the problem of food insecurity. And diet is arguably a much more important factor for your weight than exercise is. So speaking of which, when we talk about that subsidizing access to healthy food idea, it addresses food insecurity, which is arguably a bigger culprit of obesity than lack of exercise, and it levels the playing field in terms of socioeconomic access. But it could be costly and have to take government spending from other programs and apply it to these subsidies, and so it might also generate some difficulty in getting political support behind these subsidies for access to healthy food because you're shifting the funding from certain programs, which somebody else in government is not going to be happy with because those are their projects. Why should they have to agree to their projects not getting money and putting it to these other places? And then you have the public-private partnership idea. You can coordinate with existing organizations already involved in addressing obesity in children and using their infrastructure. But you're also involving multiple organizations that have their own ways of doing things. And so that could be very clunky and not cohesive. And the coordination could be quite difficult because you're having both government and a private or nonprofit organization being involved. So when you have more organizations being involved, it's inherently going to be a little bit more difficult to coordinate efficiently. So overall, the overall point of illustrating that example of my policy analysis project was that each of these proposals had strong points, each of them had weak points, things that they addressed that other policies didn't or couldn't. So it's that same concept that could be applied to basically any other reform idea you have. So if somebody tells you that there's nothing wrong with their policy, you should be very skeptical, basically. But there's also very little incentive to publicly admit that there are flaws in your policy, unless all sides that are involved in a policy or reform dispute are genuinely willing to admit that they don't have all the answers and that they're going to accept critiques of their ideas. But you don't really see that happen very often in politics. It does not behoove people running for office or even interest groups who are trying to get their chosen candidate elected into office. It does not behoove them to admit, well, I guess there could be this problem with my policy. No, they're not going to say that. Politicians must appear to be steadfast to not anger their polarized supporters, their very ardent supporters, because then otherwise they might pull for somebody in the primary to challenge that candidate, especially if they're an incumbent. People in general are reluctant to admit that they're wrong or could possibly be wrong. Hey, look, we've all been there. I've been there. It's not fun to admit that you're wrong, but some people can take that a lot more than other people can. And then everybody wants their policy implemented because it benefits them in some way, or at least they think it benefits them in some way. But no matter what your policy is, you have to work with other people to get it implemented. Whether they support your idea or not, you have to spend time trying to build a coalition. Because sometimes people just wonder, why can't we just do X thing? It'd just be so easy. It's so easy. Just do this thing. Problem is, human beings are involved with all their own interests and priorities and biases, and so it's never that simple. You should always be skeptical of easy ideas when it comes to political reforms, because they're never easy. Whatever your idea for reform or policy change is, you have to get other people to sign on to this idea, and so you need a strategy. But finding out who your supporters are or your potential supporters are is not always easy. Some people will be pretty obvious, but you have to spend money and time finding out who these people are. You might have to do polls. You might have to do focus groups. In any case, you're going to have to do a deep dive in the electorate and figure out prominent interest groups and which people are regular voters, because people who are they're inconsistent in their voting, they're going to be hard to rely on to generate a coalition. Doesn't mean that you don't try to get them to support you, but it is going to be harder for them to, or for you to get them to come and support your idea. And even would-be supporters may not help you out, even if you are mostly on the same page. For example, you might find a congressperson that really likes your idea, and they might tell you in private, hey, I like your idea, but there's an influential block of constituents of mine who would be very pissed off if I supported this thing. So I cannot publicly support you. Sometimes you see politicians say things off the record, and you get their quote, but you don't actually see who said it. And like-minded people might not be fully on the same page because they disagree on key details. So if we go back to that maximum age limit on government officials again, maybe you get a whole bunch of people that say, yeah, we do need that. But they may not agree on the exact age. This one person over here says it should be 70. And somebody says, well, that's a little low. How about 75? And then another person says, well, that's too low too. How about 80? And then somebody else comes in and says, you guys need to go all in on this. We need it to be 60. Or maybe you agree on the exact age, but are current officials exempt from it? So even if there is like a 90-year-old that's in office right now, to get his support or her support, you might need to say, okay, you are exempt from this. It's only people who are elected after this point in time. Or maybe people can be exempt from the age limit if they pass a cognitive test. But then what does the cognitive test entail? This is something I talked about either the first or second episode of this podcast here. It's about this age limit debate. And then some people might otherwise fully be on the same page as you, but have other priorities they are working on and not enough bandwidth to help you. Or they don't care enough about politics to want to get involved. Sometimes we talk a big game about what we should do, but we don't really actually try to make it reality. So somebody might say, we need immigration reform, but they just say that, but don't actually do anything about trying to make that happen. Not even like participating in conversations about it. And that's not necessarily to rag on them, because some people just have a lot of other things that they have to do. But there are also other people who they talk a big game and they could do something about it and they just choose not to. But again, that's not everybody. And so it's easy to say we need to do something, but then actually trying to make it happen, that's a whole other thing. Whatever the case may be, whatever the policy is, you're going to have to try to get people on your side. And that might take a little bit of coaxing is not the right word, but it's the only one I can think of right now. It might take a little bit of prodding to get them to come to your side. But we are not as persuasive and well-reasoned as we think we are. Because, once again, we are oftentimes overconfident in our abilities, especially when it comes to politics. Our biases influence how much we think we have thought things through. But even if we do have some talent in persuasion, some people are just going to be set in their ways, and there is nothing you can do to convince them. It's just not going to happen. You might be the opposite party of them. You might be the opposite ideology of them, and they are just not going to hear what you have to say. Even if it's something that's not necessarily a, a partisan or ideological issue, they might still be like, nah, I'm not helping you. And so they just won't listen to you. And even if we have hashed out a lot of the details in our plan, we don't oftentimes really have a strategy or think far enough ahead into the future. And I actually refer back to episode 49 of this podcast that I did with Graham Bernstein and Jacob Kaplan of the Florida Student Policy Forum, where they talked about, working with legislators and trying to get them on your side and having to work with them. If you just yell at them and make them enemies, they're not going to listen to you. We like to think we could just run roughshod over the opposition. But guess what? They'll return the favor the next time they are in power or any chance they get. And the pendulum inevitably swings back against you. Now, some people might look in sub-states that are very heavily Republican or heavily Democrat, but in Congress, at some point, the pendulum swings from Republican back to Democrat, from Democrat back to Republican. And even in these states that are one-party rule, there are factions within those parties that will duke it out. And so if you're the more ideological wing of that party, and you're the more moderate wing of that party, pendulum will swing back and forth to some extent as well. And then even the people in the more extreme wing will start fighting each other, or the moderate wing will start fighting each other. So it behooves you to try to work more with other people. There are a lot of incentives to not do that, but there are also a lot of incentives long-term for you to work with other people. And even if you can't achieve all your goals, you can achieve at least some of them working with other people. Now, for some people, they think it's completely immoral to not stand on business, and they'd rather just lose wholesale than win a little bit because they think it's compromising their values, which is not the way to think about things, but it's how a lot of people view politics. Some people just won't work with you if they don't think they can achieve everything that they can, or they really believe that they can achieve everything they can by just, bulldozing everybody. But it comes back to bite you in the end. But now let's get past the actual formulation of the policy. Now let's talk about the results of the policy. Especially this question: does your idea actually achieve the benefits you think it will? When you get even partially invested in your idea, it is very easy to assume that it will have all the benefits you believe it will, that you expect it to have. Oh, this thing is going to save us so much money in the future. Oh, this will lead to so much less infighting. This will lead to more voter turnout, blah, blah, blah. But does that really happen? You might be surprised. I'm not even talking about unintended consequences. It might just be that it just doesn't quite work the way you think it will. You can make all projections you want. It's often hard to know what the effects truly will be until they actually happen, hence those unintended consequences. But the benefits you are looking for might happen, but not to the extent you want. So maybe you have a reform idea that you expect will increase voter turnout by 10%, but the results say that it's only about 5% more. Now, you did somewhat achieve that goal, but it wasn't quite what you thought was going to happen. And even when you think a benefit will intuitively arise from a reform, it may not work out the way you expect it to because the way you looked at a problem was flawed. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to use the example of some reforms in voting that we saw from the 1970s through the 1990s that were aimed at making voting and registering to vote much less onerous. So we are talking about primarily early voting, absentee voting, and the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, which is also called the Motor Voter Act. Now, early voting and absentee voting didn't all start at that point, but they became much more common and expanded throughout the United States back in those decades. what some people call the nerds. But here's a little bit of background for it. So there was an idea that a couple of political scientists had that basically people were not voting because the U.S. has compared to other democratic countries, even ones without mandatory voting, has a fairly low voter turnout rate comparatively. And the idea was that, people were not voting because there were major tangible barriers to voting, which there were. There was a lot of times travel distance. You might have had to travel a really long way to go register to vote, or you might have had to register well before election day. And then you need to have access to this information that told you when to be registered to vote and what you needed to register to vote. Especially back in the 1970s, we didn't have the internet, so you couldn't just look this stuff up. And even today, sometimes it's hard to find this information, even though we do have the internet. When early voting and absentee voting were being implemented, the assumption was made that it would increase voter turnout because voting became easier. And in 1993, that Motor Voter Act directed states to allow voter registration at motor vehicle agencies and through mail-in procedures. So voting and registering to vote became easier than ever. And today, it's easier than ever to do those things. So, how much do you think that voter turnout increased with those? Well, results say that those reforms didn't actually impact voter turnout much. Now, some would even argue that turnout decreased, or at least it hasn't consistently increased since then. So partially depends on which states you look at. The results said that actually most of the people taking advantage of early and absentee voting were going to vote on election day anyways. They just saw, okay, I could just do it without going to the polling place, or I can do it before election day. Okay, I'll just do it then. So, well, that's weird. Why, if we're making voting easier than ever to do, why aren't people doing it? What were these reforms missing? Well, political scientist and Professor Adam Berinsky argued that we were focusing on the wrong types of costs. Now, obviously or when we talk about costs, don't necessarily mean like actual monetary costs. Sometimes we are talking about costs in time and effort. The tangible barriers like the cost in time, money, effort to register to vote and cast a ballot, that, according to Professor Berinsky, is not actually the cost that we should have been focusing on. Or not to say that he didn't think that those were good reforms. I mean, they were good reforms, but the actual costs that weren't addressed are the cognitive effort of becoming involved with and informed about politics. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. A lot of people that are in politics like me, we find it's very hard for us to appreciate the reasons that other people have for not getting involved in politics. And it's not because, they don't want to, or that they're lazy, or that they don't care. It's just that they don't have time, or they don't know why they should be interested. They just have, for some reason or another, they're unenthused about the choices they have, or think about, man, what's the point of going to vote? And they might really want a reason to vote. At least in their minds, they think they don't have a reason to vote. Problem is, people being registered to vote doesn't inherently make them vote. Just because you're getting all these people registered doesn't mean, okay, you know what, I'll go vote. Some of them didn't go to vote not because they found it onerous, but because they just didn't care. They weren't interested. Lots of registered voters don't vote in elections, especially when you get to non-presidential elections. It's about interest and engagement. You will not truly increase voter engagement consistently until it becomes easier to sift through political info, and more voters are consistently more interested in and engaged with politics. And that's a very tall task. And again, that's not a solution to say, we need to make voters more consistently engaged and interested in politics. That is not a solution. How are we going to make them more interested and engaged? And that is a very long-standing question. And no matter what you do, you're never going to get 100% voter turnout. It's just not going to happen. Even if we made mandatory voting a thing, you still would not get 100%. Again, that does not mean that these reforms like early voting and absentee voting and increased access to voter registration weren't necessary, because they were. They just didn't really do what they set out to do on their own. So even though you think intuitively, this is going to fix this problem that we have, this problem of low voter turnout in this case, that's not what actually happened. And in some cases, it might have upped it a little bit. There might have been a little bit of an uptick, but then it went down again. It was never consistent. So think harder about whether your idea for reform or policy change will really lead to the benefit that you expect. Ultimately, though, we need to recognize the importance of critiquing our own ideas. Intuitively, a lot of us get the importance of self-assessment, and we think we self-assess. A lot of times we don't really do that, though, or at least we're not good at it. Now, some people just think they have everything figured out. There's a lot of people like that, or at least a lot of loud people like that. They're the ones that pop up on social media all the time and that are pundits. They you just need to listen to them and you'll get all the answers from them, or politicians. But there are other people who genuinely want to get better at critical thinking, even if they think that they're better at it than they actually are. But they do want to get better at critical thinking. They don't necessarily know how. And all of us can get better at it, myself included. I'm always trying to improve on that front. But again, like I said before, everybody falls into that trap of thinking they know more than they actually do. And that happens to me sometimes. And I try to be as self-aware as possible about that. But self-assessment is unbelievably important. I'm a big advocate for self-awareness. And it might seem like a self-evident thing, but it's not. We really need to stress the benefits of self-assessment, like how it keeps us grounded. We get better at what we are doing naturally. We become more self-aware, which is in short supply these days. We break unproductive habits and get closer to our goals, and in this case, policy goals. And we get healthier civic engagement and decreased polarization, which makes things function a lot better. None of us have 100% of the truth figured out. So if we really care about truth, like we say we do, because ostensibly we all care about truth, we need to seek self-improvement. We need to be constantly refining and critiquing our own beliefs. Doesn't mean you need to change everything wholesale, but it does mean that you need to look at little bits at least and think, okay, you know what? This part, I have new information. I don't think X about this anymore. If we don't critique our ideas or genuinely hear out different viewpoints, it's always going to lead to bad or heavily flawed policy. You don't notice your own blind spots, and therefore you miss other points for improvements. And you also just make other people mad at you, which some people enjoy, some people like to troll, but they're not going to listen to you in turn. And then you might find, oh, wait, I need those people to at least help me out a little bit in some way. And they're going to purposely screw you over. And then it's just going to lead to this culture of one-upmanship that we constantly see. And we also just can't continue to improve things if we're going to act this way where we just don't listen to other viewpoints. This country has not improved in any point in time except for when it's been introspective and when it's tried to incorporate other views, when it's tried to take in new information. Most notably, when expanding rights like voting to more demographics, with race and gender as the two prominent examples there, eliminating slavery and Jim Crow laws. Those did not come or would not have come if we weren't more introspective as a nation and we didn't hear other ideas out. And so more improvements are necessary, and those improvements are not going to come unless we actually listen to other people. Because no matter what our background is, no matter what our demographics are, none of us are above listening to other people and hearing other viewpoints, because everybody's got a perspective that, even if it's flawed or maybe they have bad information, just the act of at least letting them speak is going to make political discourse a lot better. And we can come to a much greater understanding and help revitalize the civic health of this nation. Obviously, it's a lot easier said than done, just like how this whole episode was about how policy ideas are much easier said than done, but it's something we should constantly strive for. So hopefully that gave you a lot of applicable, practical information to use so that you can critique your own ideas. And there are things that I need to make sure I remind myself of whenever I come across an idea that I really get tied up in and think, this is the thing. This is the one. I just need other people to hear it. It's so obvious. It's not obvious. If you think an idea is easy and obvious, almost never is. And if it is, it's only for a very specific, particular thing. When you're talking about broad ideas, broad fixes, broad policy, it's never an easy or obvious solution. Bear that in mind. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Politics with Paul. Thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and also rate the show and review, please. So links in the show notes. I'll also link Stephanie Houghton's Substack that I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode so that you can see what ultimately spawned this idea that I had. Although it's something I kind of played around with a little bit for a while, but that Substack piece really got me going on this. So I'll link to that. But then my other links, my LinkedIn profile that I write on very frequently, my Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker, my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com, my 5-day educational email course about how we can all improve on depolarizing politics in America, my book on Amazon about political independence and why they struggle so much and how they could potentially make their lives easier when it comes to running for office. Not arguing that we should or shouldn't have more of them. It's just things to think about a topic that's not very well discussed or understood. And is there another thing I'm missing? Oh, my medium.com profile that I write on from time to time. So that is going to wrap things up for today. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.